Good morning, good afternoon, and good day to you from Warsaw. My name is Patricia Galdames. I'm the Senior Advisor here at the Permanent Secretariat of the Community of Democracies. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion today on developing safeguards to prevent the abuse of new technologies and growing influence of digital authoritarianism, which is a side event organized by the Permanent Secretariat in coordination with the Working Group on Democracy and Technology in the framework of the 10th Ministerial Conference of the Community of Democracies, which just recently took place last week. While technology has brought solutions that support democracy and democratic institutions, such as digital governance platforms, it has also presented challenges with new technologies that are being misused. In our time today, we will have an exchange on potential ways to address the misuse of technologies and also be able to look at ways to better prevent and respond to digital threats targeting democracy and democratic institutions. It is now my pleasure to invite His Excellency, Mr. Lasha Darsalia, First Deputy Minister of Georgia, who will be providing opening remarks this morning. Deputy Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, dear colleagues. I would like to welcome you to the virtual event of the Working Group on Democracy and Technology, and thank you for finding the time to join today's discussions. Mr. Secretary General, let me use this occasion and express sincere appreciation to the Permanent Secretariat of the Community of Democracies for the valuable assistance in organizing this event that gives us an opportunity to discuss the interlinkage between democracy and digital technologies, the latter's role for bettering effective and accountable governance, as well as ways to address threats emanating from them. Ladies and gentlemen, these days, digital technologies have penetrated into all areas of our lives. They shrank time and distance, and their role is constantly increasing. The COVID-19 pandemic has further accelerated this process and once again showed us the digital technology's importance. We welcome the adoption of the declaration of the 10th Ministerial Conference of the Community of Democracies just a few days ago, which inter alia recognizes the significant role and potential of digital technologies for effective and accountable democratic governance, as well as for an inclusive and resilient recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and accelerated achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Obviously, technologies have created more opportunities for citizens to be engaged in democratic processes, including by expanding their access to information, their opportunities to exercise their right to freedom of expression, and promoting their participation in civic life. Digital technologies are becoming key for sustainable development. They offer possibility to support the advancement of gender equality, including by full, equal, and effective participation of women in political, economic, cultural, and social life. This list goes on. However, regrettably, we have been also witnessing the growing threats emanating from the abuse of information and communication technologies, which include cyber threats, widening inequalities, growing spread of disinformation, misinformation, and surveillance. Unfortunately, my own country has several times fallen victim of cyber attacks and propaganda war inter alia, and further continues facing hybrid warfare on daily basis. These mailing activities of malevolent actors undermine the enjoyment of human rights, threaten democratic governments and societies, and erode the rules-based international order. Against the background of challenge confidence in democratic systems by evolving digital threats, coordinated actions and engagement in multilateral and multi-stakeholder fora become as important as ever for mitigating technologically enabled threats to ensure enjoyment of human rights and democracy. Strength is in unity. Therefore, through our working group, we can contribute to these efforts by joint discussion, sharing experience and lessons learned, and coming up with valuable recommendations to put digital technology in the service of democracy and not in determinant to it. Georgia, as the chair of working group, is ready and will continue its efforts towards the realization of agenda of this valuable initiative. With this, let me wish you for fruitful discussion. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Minister, and thank you for your remarks and the importance certainly that Georgia is putting to digital technologies and the work at the helm of the working group on democracy and technology. Thank you. Before we begin the panel discussion, I would like to just encourage the audience to ask questions through the chat mechanism, and we will certainly come back to them later during the event. Also, I would like you to note that you will be able to find the full biographies of our speakers today in the chat mechanism. Now, it is my great pleasure and privilege to give the floor to our keynote speaker and very good friend, Dr. Tamika Tilleman. He's a very good friend of the community of democracies. Dr. Tilleman is a partner and global head of policy for the crypto team at Anderson Horowitz, where he builds public policy architecture to support the next generation of the internet. More recently, he also served as the executive director of the Digital Impact and Governance Initiative at New America, where he led programs to address social impact, finance, and governance challenges worldwide. He also previously served as senior advisor to 2 US Secretaries of State. On the staff also of the Senate of the Foreign Affairs Committee, he worked with Joe Biden, Barack Obama, and John Kerry. He also served as a member of the World Economic Forum's Council for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. His impressive list of accomplishments actually go on, so I will stop there and give the floor to you. Tamika, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for that overly generous introduction. It's wonderful to be with all of you and a real privilege to be a part of this important discussion today. We are at a very critical moment in the evolution of technology and really in human history more broadly. We are witnessing right now the dawn of the third generation of the internet, and that can't come soon enough. Because what we've seen is that the second generation of the internet has unleashed a variety of challenges, both in democracies and around the world in authoritarian governments. And unless we can come up with a better alternative to the second generation of the internet, we're going to be in real trouble. This new third generation of the internet, Web3, encompasses a variety of different systems that have received an extraordinary amount of attention over the last few years and have the potential to serve as the basis for new forms of economic, social, and political interaction that will enable people to collaborate, create, and exchange far more effectively than they do today. But again, we need to solve the challenges that have been created by the systems that we've all come to rely on in our digital lives. Web 2.0, which is the internet of big centralized platforms, both big businesses that use our information, but also authoritarian governments, has transformed our lives in many profound ways. Web 2.0 took a wrong turn at some point in its development, and I think we all need to recognize this. And neither the public sector nor the private sector has really figured out the correct strategy, any real strategy, for grappling with the Pandora's box of privacy breaches, disinformation, monopolistic practices, and algorithmic biases that have come to define much of our modern internet. Meanwhile, we see authoritarian governments taking advantage of the centralized nature of Web 2, and they have never had more data with which to surveil and censor and manipulate not only their citizens, but the citizens of other nations. And that's having a profound impact in the way our democratic processes unfold and the perceived integrity of our democratic institutions. If the past decade has taught us anything, it's that we urgently need to have a conversation about the role we want technology to play in open societies and really the rest of the world. And in this sense, the emergence of the third generation of the internet, the emergence of Web3, isn't just a new wave of innovation. It provides us with an opportunity for a reset. And it should allow us, if we do this right, to disperse the benefits of this technology more broadly, while mitigating some of the very serious challenges that we have seen occur as a consequence of digital innovation. Defining a vision, defining an affirmative vision for how we want to use technology in our lives and societies is a task that is too large and too important for any organization to tackle on its own. We need policymakers, innovators, companies, universities, civil society organizations, and those that are investing in the future of these technologies to all work together to develop a more comprehensive, common vision for how we want these technologies to evolve. But we believe firmly that now is the time to build these solutions. We cannot delay further. We need to move forward. What are some of the common attributes that we should seek for this new generation of the internet? We hope and believe that the next generation of the internet should be more open and inclusive, that it should be participatory and well-governed, that it should be distributed and resilient. We've seen the challenges that occur with overly centralized systems and the power dynamics that can occur as a result of overly centralized systems. We believe the next generation of the internet should be sustainable, accountable, efficient, secure, equipped to protect individual privacy, and critically designed to help individuals and communities, not middlemen, capture more of the value they create for society. We have seen the emergence of a dynamic in which information too often is given up by individuals and then used against them. We believe that Web3 technologies can change that narrative and provide individuals with greater ownership and greater autonomy in how they live their digital lives. Web3 technologies have the potential to help realize all of these objectives, but I think it's critical to note that we will need a clear policy framework to get there. I'll say that I am radically optimistic about the potential of these solutions to restore trust in our institutions, to enable new kinds of cooperation and more effective democratic governance. And we believe these tools can help break through the stalemates that define too many aspects of public life and democracies right now, and facilitate more effective collective decision-making, including around critical issues such as how networks will evolve and what behaviors are going to be permitted online. As at a fundamental level, we believe that these technologies will be tools for coordinating human activity. And these systems build on existing internet infrastructure to distribute power, resources, and information across a wide array of stakeholders. The fact that this new generation of technologies is distributed, we believe is one of the key elements that can help us moving forward, and one of the principles that policymakers should look at as they approach this new generation of the internet. Web3 systems should be open and accountable to their users and provide alternatives to a digital status quo that is dominated by big tech and exploitative oppressive regimes that use information against their citizens. Web 3.0 systems should be decentralized because decentralization is one of the defining elements of democracy's past and future success. Decentralized competition was the foundation of democracy's growth and dynamism in the 20th century, when it helped democracies outcompete authoritarian adversaries. And we believe that decentralization can help us succeed in the face of new challenges today. Decentralization of power fosters democratized technology platforms that embody the values of open society and will provide the infrastructure we need to power tomorrow's economy and institutions. We also believe that policymakers will need to work with the technology community to design regulatory frameworks and policy frameworks around these technologies that carefully calibrate the policy framework to the risks that are inherent in any technology. In the United States, certainly, our technological and financial leadership, and really the leadership of democracies everywhere, depend on developing world-class systems that support functions like digital identity, better payments, better data management, and broader access to opportunity. Those systems can emerge as we create public-private collaboration that yields sensible, thoughtful policy frameworks and standards that address the levels of risk that we are going to encounter as these technologies are more widely deployed. We believe that policymakers need to act quickly to create a framework for the broader adoption of these technologies. In 1997, in the United States, you saw the administration of then President Bill Clinton publish a groundbreaking framework that provided 9 recommendations and some key principles for how the first generation of the internet should evolve. At that time, there was a consensus around 5 principles. The first being that the private sector should lead. The second, that government should avoid undue restrictions on electronic commerce, that governments should be involved as needed in these efforts, and they should support a predictable policy framework around the evolution of these tools. The government should recognize the unique qualities of the internet, and that electronic activity on the internet should be facilitated on a global basis. We stand at the threshold of a similar moment when it comes to Web3 technologies, where policymakers can establish principles on which the next generation of the internet will be built. It's important for us to recognize that policy today in this realm is far behind. There is not the degree of domestic activity in most democracies, and certainly not the degree of international coordination that you would hope to see in order for open societies to develop compelling alternatives to the technology platforms that are being put forward by authoritarian regimes. But there is still time to get this right. If you compare the use of many of the technologies that will form the foundation of the third generation of the internet to the technologies that form the foundation of the second generation of the internet, you see that we're about at the year 2000 in terms of adoption. So things are moving quickly, but many of the most important innovations and certainly many of the largest actors in our modern internet emerged after the year 2000. And that means that there's still time to get this right if we operate rapidly. We believe that every democracy should establish a national strategy to prioritize the development of world-class digital systems that will advance and protect democratic values. One of the major shortcomings that democracies have encountered in recent years is that there has been severe fragmentation in the policy space. And we hope and expect that as policymakers lean into these discussions, as we're seeing today, and I certainly want to commend the community of democracies for providing this important platform for advancing a conversation on how we should use these tools to advance democratic values and counter authoritarianism, that we can address the degree of fragmentation that has emerged over the last few years. To the extent countries can develop compelling national strategies and also facilitate global cooperation to support work on the third generation of the internet. We believe that, again, there is a window in which to put forward a better set of alternatives to the paradigms that we are stuck with today. Ideally, we will provide a framework for democracies to address key challenges such as digital identity, property rights and the ownership of digital goods, the need to secure information and the need to secure our financial systems, access to critical services, especially critical public services, individual data sovereignty and data usage. So the idea that individuals should own their information and have greater control over their information, the need to preserve privacy, and the critical importance of resilience in our digital infrastructure. Strategies that address these issues can provide the foundation for democracy's long-term success and send a signal around the world that democracies can be leaders in developing systems that benefit their citizens. They could also create a starting point for the public-private partnerships that will be needed to achieve these goals. This is going to be a long, complex process, and I certainly don't want to give the impression that the work involved is going to be simple or that it's going to happen quickly. We should view this, frankly, as a generational commitment to getting our digital house in order across the world's democratic governments. But this is a task that is very deserving of our investment. The nature of technology is changing, and the extent to which we live our lives in a digital world is expanding rapidly. That was true before the pandemic. It is dramatically more true today. And so we need to make the investment of time and energy to get this right. Many of our core institutions today are struggling. Web3 offers a new set of tools that can help policymakers and democracies meet the needs of citizens. As a fundamentally new technology paradigm, the advantages of decentralized, digitally secured platforms really cut across sectors. Virtually every portion of our society and every portion of our economies could benefit from more secure, resilient, inclusive digital infrastructure. We will see greater economic prosperity that will enable democracies to compete more effectively in an increasingly competitive world. And critically, the opportunity for new modes of participatory, accountable governance that can help our institutions be more responsive to the needs of stakeholders and citizens. We believe that these tools can help build a better vision for how to use technology in open societies, one that moves beyond the excesses of surveillance capitalism and protects people from the abuses of surveillance authoritarianism. Policymakers who want a better alternative to the status quo, though, will need to act quickly to ensure that these breakthroughs realize their full potential. We will need to address some key questions along the way that we still have not answered. We will need to understand how to define the authorities to govern and oversee these technologies within our democracies. We'll have to think about the intersection of Web3 and traditional legacy systems and sectors across our society. We'll have to look at how to translate national strategies into a global agenda for the third generation of the internet. It is difficult, again, to overstate the importance of the task ahead. We've got a lot of work on the horizon, but the opportunity and the magnitude of the opportunity is really breathtaking. These technologies can usher in a renaissance of creativity, of innovation, of democratic participation, and prosperity with few parallels in human history. And that opportunity is why we are here. It's why we're committed to working with policymakers and civil society and the private sector to get this right. And we believe that together we can build a third generation of the internet that looks less like the web we have and more like the web democracies deserve. And we look forward to collaborating with you in that effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamika, for your key insights and really for providing a framework for the rest of our conversation today. Many of your thoughts, of course, on what this next generation of the internet will look like, this Web 3.0. We will come back to you for more information on that. You mentioned something that is obviously key and that we know at the Community of Democracies is the importance of having all the stakeholders working together, policymakers, the government, civil society, the private sector, everyone working together to develop a common vision to build these very important solutions, as you said, to help restore trust, to facilitate this conversation and collaboration. And as you mentioned, we couldn't agree more. It is a long and complex process to get in place this, you mentioned the digital house in order. Perfect way of saying that. But we do hope that the conversation here today really opens up a further conversation and a more in-depth conversation about the role that technology can play in this regard and how to really advance technology vis-a-vis democratic values. Thank you once again, Tamika.
My pleasure.
Let me now introduce briefly our panelists. We have four very interesting panelists today. Our first panelist is Ms. Paulina Ibarra. She is the executive director of Fundación Multitudes. This is an NGO in Chile. She's also the chair of the civil society pillar of the Community of Democracies and a member of the working group on democracy and technology. She has a global experience in the areas of transparency, citizen participation, and accountability, and has worked in government, the private sector, and also with international organizations. Paulina, Mr. Iyad Al-Olamat, my apologies for not pronouncing it correctly. He is a youth activist and the founder and director of Olimax Technology. Olimax Technology is an organization that aims to provide awareness, national projects using new communication technologies to support and facilitate the participation of citizens in political life. We also have with us today Luisa Tomar. She is the Senior Program Officer at the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE, overseeing cross-regional programs on digital commerce and digital governance, the rise of digital authoritarianism, and the future of democracy, technology, and markets. And finally, our last speaker is Mr. Luis Fernando Garcia. He is the Executive Director of Red en Defensa de los Derechos Digitales. This would be in Spanish, the Network for the Defense of Digital Rights, if I got that correct, from Mexico. And this NGO is one of the civil society organizations that is engaged in the national open government process in Mexico. So welcome to all our panelists. Now let's hear from our distinguished panelists. Let me ask just the first question to our panelist, Paulina. Paulina, we know that democratic governance is more effective when there is inclusive participation. That is, where those affected by public policies are consulted and are able to provide feedback and to contribute to public accountability. What are the basic ingredients needed to facilitate a productive collaboration between civil society, government, the private sector, and others on the use of technology to improve democratic governance? Can you provide us your insights on that?
Sure, and first of all, let me thank you and thank the Permanent Secretariat of the Community of Democracies for this invitation, for also acknowledging the Democracy and Technology Working Group. We have been doing great work, and I'm very proud to be part of this event and other events in the working group. And let me tell you a little bit more about how I see this question. You know, as Tamika mentioned, technology is a key tool to close the gap between authorities and citizens in decision-making processes, and we've been discussing that for a long time. But it's a crucial element for transparency, access to information, citizen participation, and accountability, which are also pillars of the open government scheme. In my perspective, the basic ingredient to facilitate a collaboration on the use of technology to improve democratic governance is equal, free, and diligent access to these tools. As Tamika mentioned before, we need to be inclusive when thinking about the next generation of the internet. And if not, what happens is that technology finally enables democratic backsliding. And as we know, that's the elimination of political institutions that sustain our different democracies. So first, we can talk about using technology to improve our democracies if there is not a democratization in the access to these tools. For example, in the Caribbean, the internet penetration rate is only 62%, while in Northern Europe, it's almost 97%. This means Caribbean citizens are have less access to information, public services, and participation mechanism than citizens from Northern Europe. And this has been aggravated by the pandemic, unfortunately. Second, technological tools won't serve democracies if they're used against citizens through authoritarian practices like laws to diminish different basic freedoms. Recently, we have seen in some countries how a real phenomenon like disinformation is used as a pretext to sentence people for up to 5 years in jail based on the decisions of a biased justice systems. Lastly, technology does not improve democracy if it is used to nullify, prevent, or restrict the political rights of people. And this is happening with women in politics, especially in electoral processes, when they are targets of highly coordinated disinformation campaigns. And to prevent this, we need to collaboratively work civil society, government, private sector, and others to build mechanisms to promote due diligence in the usage of digital tools.
Thank you, Paulina. That's very important, I think, what you mentioned about the crucial aspect of technology, that technology plays actually for citizen participation, to improve democratic governance, to improve transparency, all very positive things that technology actually brings, but also to bring a very important point that I think we need to keep in mind. And it's that access really to technology and technology tools that not everybody has.
Correct.
Around the world. Obviously, there is a big difference between the continents you were mentioning, of course, the lack of access, for example, in the internet in various parts of the world. So this is something that obviously policymakers really need to look at the same time. Can I just ask you one more question? From
Sure.
your experience, what do you think, what type of democracy standards do you think can be put in place right now for in this digital age to actually look at mitigating the actual technologically enabled threats? Can you talk to us about that?
Absolutely. I think this definitely links with my previous answer. To mitigate technology, enable threats like disinformation against women in electoral processes, we must address this issue with a gender and intersectional perspective, and then develop strategies in 3 areas. This is the perspective of that we have at our organization: research, education, and regulation. So firstly, we must acknowledge that disinformation affects women in a different way than men, and different vulnerabilities intersect. For example, we can see that violence against women in politics, like women are targeted because of their gender. We see that nowadays. Unfortunately, this is technology. We need to acknowledge the fact that it is a double-edged sword, particularly when it comes to women that wanted to participate of electoral processes. Then also, if the comment is sexist and violent against their gender in the form of expression and or execution. Third, the intention and impact to discourage female political participation on, or even prevent it or hinder it. Also, when I speak about the intersectional approach, we must recognize that there are risk factors that increase the vulnerability of women, such as, for example, being a member of the opposition or being young, especially under 40. And third, belonging to a minority group, for example, ethnic, social, LGBT, or other minorities. Once we address this technological enabled threat with a gender and intersectional approach, we can definitely develop effective strategies to mitigate it. On this occasion, I think that it's important that we address the issue of the education and regulation. We need to document and analyze this information and its specific impact on women's participation in politics, so we can collectively respond to this phenomena, particularly given that currently about 25% of women in the world hold seats in parliament. At least that's our research for 2020. And this is a number that actually has decreased. It's highly worrisome that right now Latin America and the Caribbean, my region, despite that women participation in electoral processes below 25%, there is no data on how many women withdraw from public office as candidates once they become victims of disinformation. The majority of the existing information is based on observational studies carried out basically in the US, Canada, and in some countries of Europe with a small sample of women. Having data is crucial to develop strategies to tackle disinformation and prevent democratic backsliding, as more women's representation means more stability, equality, and social welfare, because research shows that women prioritize health, education, and development, and their participation boosts citizens' confidence in democracy. Finally, as a pre-launch of the Women's Observatory Against Disinformation and Fake News, an initiative carried out by Fundación Multitudes, we recently published the results of a survey of all Congress and Senator women in Chile and about their perspective with disinformation and fake news. And sadly, 96.8% of them have said to be victims of disinformation as gender bias violence. So it is a real threat to democracy, technology. We really need to look into the different areas I mentioned, educating, making sure that we have a legal framework to prevent and combat this type of phenomenon, and finally work towards creating safeguards to make sure that women are participating equally of democratic processes. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you, Paulina. And thank you for actually highlighting how disinformation is actually affecting women, how disinformation and fake news is particularly affecting women, and the need of looking into these solutions and to actually putting, if we talk about in technology enabled threats, and to really looking at it also from a gender perspective. I think it's very important, all the points that you made and the work that you're doing right now in Chile. Thank you for that, Paulina.
Thank you, Patricia.
Let's move to our second speaker. Iyad, digital transformation touches upon all aspects of public life and has the capacity to improve efficiency and effectiveness of public services, as we mentioned before, can help provide an important channel, certainly for the participations of citizens in public life. And in that regard, also plays a very important role in making sure that we have, and we hear, and we have the participation of youth as well in public life. Can you tell us about your experience in working with technology to facilitate this participations of citizens in public life, in political life in particular, including in elections, and in particular, if you have addressed the threat of misinformation and disinformation in this regard?
All right. Well, thank you for your questions and for the invitation to be part of this panel. As you mentioned regarding the technologies, everything is now related to how to be able to easily communicate with others. With the rapid use of technologies, with the social media, it's easier now to be able to get in touch with everyone that you really want to have an information with. And for me, regarding whether that would be the youth or we talk about all segments of the societies are actually have an access to use of such technologies. One of the major actually benefits of using such technologies to be able to participate in the decision-making process at all levels. So I'll just talk about one-sided kind of processes that will be just talking about be part of the elections and not be able to be part of actually making an amendment to laws that are actually going to be affecting our lives. With public participations with the process within the legislative process results in better laws and fewer amendments. In my experiences, what we have actually tried to achieve to such a goals that our organizations specializes in creating platforms that work in and enhancing the citizens' democracy sensations by establishing a communication channels between the citizens and their representatives at all elected councils. By that, we make the people to be able to communicate with their representatives to be part of the changing of the laws that actually can affect them. If you can imagine if yourself as a representative and you have the ability to be able to have a feedback from your community, and that can be done within a shortly manner of time, to be able to have a better kind of representations for your people. We created such platforms using our mobile applications, websites, and social media. The idea of it is to bridge the gap between the citizens and public authorities in order to ensure a sustainable inclusiveness and participations in these democratic processes. By having a reliable and accredited platform by the citizens and elected officials and government, by having such a platforms as a communication channels between them. Well, the idea of it is to be able to be part of the equation at all time, at all levels. Regarding the mitigations of the threat, as you mentioned, this is a double kind of sorted solutions. We need to make sure that we can protect and promote the strong encryptions and anonymity of options online. So we can ensure that we have provided the safety for the people to participate easily in such kind of technologies. And we need to prevent, if I'm talking about kind of recommendations to mitigate the risk of such technologies, we need to prevent the network shutdowns by making laws that actually can ensure the access to internet at all times. We need to prohibit the use of the surveillance technologies that actually can manipulate the people's opinions, that can actually change by making some kind of rumors, some kind of surveillance tracking of the people that uses such technologies that can make easier for them to make it changes based on what you actually taking surveillance without the right or taking their approval, the right to privacy. And we need to close the digital divide and secure affordable internet access for all in order to make sure that we actually have a change with use such technologies. Finally, if I can make sure that if we're aligning with the goals of the 2030 agendas, that we need to make sure that we have an access of public information for all, we need to ensure a responsive, inclusive decision-making process at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Yahad. Very interesting points that you touched upon, especially when looking at how to mitigate these risks. I think, and I congratulate the work that your organization is making in bringing the citizens closer to government, closer to decision makers, creating those platforms and being able to establish those very important channels that, again, technology is able to provide us. But in looking at the other side, when we were talking about risk, and you get very important points, strong encryptions is certainly necessary. You mentioned the need to prohibit the use of surveillance technologies. Obviously, this is one of the biggest threats, I think, that we know are there. But something that was also mentioned by our previous speaker, Paulina, and it's closing the digital divide, I think, and everything we have spoken about so far, and certainly what our keynote speaker also spoke about in this new generation of the internet, that I think is something that that we need to certainly highlight. And it's how and what we can do to make sure that we close that digital divide. That's quite important. And another point you made, which we couldn't agree with more, in the importance of access to public information for all. Thank you very much for your insights, Ihab.
Thank you.
Now I would like just to direct some questions to our next speaker, Luisa Tomar. Luisa, the private sector, and specifically, I would say technology companies, have a key role in the development of digital technology that all sectors of society rely on to operate, including the public sector, of course. But at the same time, they also play an important role in helping to find solutions to address the risks that, again, digital technologies can pose to democracy. From your experience in SIPE, can you speak about the impact of digital transformation on democracies and the business communities?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Patricia, and thank you to the Community of Democracy for including SIPE in this session. It's incredibly timely. So I think there's an incredibly important role for the business community to play. SIPE does work with local business communities around the globe rather than with technology companies from, the US or other developed markets. So, I don't think I'll touch too much on the impact of digital transformation on democracies. I think Tamika did a fantastic job with that. But I did want to talk a bit about what we're seeing across the global business community. And a lot of it aligns very much from what we heard from Paulina related to the importance of inclusion. And so one thing that is important when it comes to the technology companies and government is to recognize that a lot of these new digital tools and services are generally to the benefit of communities that have already been included in the formal economy, that already have access to finance and commercial financial services, that are located in places with good infrastructure. Typically that's in capital cities and the largest cities. And of course, women, minorities, and persons with disabilities and others tend not to be able to have the same access to this technological change. And that is something that we've been working on. And a key piece of that is promoting public-private dialogue between the private sector and government. And I think it's important that when we talk about the private sector, we don't view it as a monolith and we don't view it as purely technology companies. Local business communities are a key piece of the stakeholder community in any democracy. And one of the troubling trends we see is that so much of public policy related to technology is focused on, let's say, reining in the largest technology companies, whether that's with new privacy policies or competition policy. And while that absolutely is of critical importance to democracies, there's also a need to assess how we create a more inclusive, enabling environment for Indigenous businesses to compete in the global digital economy, and consider how these new policies intending to shape, the role of big tech impacts these smaller businesses and their ability to join the global digital economy or offer new products and services in their markets. So I think there's a real balance here of separating, when we say business, that we're really thinking about, who falls into that category. I think another thing that we often, talk about is, this element of trust, which is so important. So, your question asking about how, these technology companies can offer these services to governments. There is an element of the trust deficit, but then we also see that business is the most trusted institution, more than NGOs, government, and the media, according to the Edelman Trust Barometer. And they're viewed as the only institution seen as both ethical and competent. So I think we do have to remember that for those of us in the policy space, there is a bit of, warranted criticism and concern with the way business is leveraging technology today, but then, thinking about how the overall public views this stakeholder group is also critical to making sure that the solutions that are established reflect the needs of the wider community, and also the leverage, the role business can play in supporting the larger democratic goals of the society. I also, think there are other ways that business and government can come together when it comes to digital transformation. We are seeing efforts, for example, in Indonesia on co-regulation. It's a co-regulation approach to digital transformation. This is a policy solution identified by the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, which is a longtime site partner. It's an economic think tank. And they suggest leveraging business associations and chambers of commerce to help serve in this co-regulation role where there would be sort of self-regulation by the business community as well as active regulation by government. While we need to see streamlined policies and frameworks, very much to Tamika's point, I also think we have to be cognizant of the capacity of regulators and their ability to implement and enforce some of these laws on the books. So we do see a lot of, thoughtful attempts at regulating technology, but it doesn't necessarily meet the capacity level of those in charge of that. And I think we do need to see the private sector step up and step in and be, a proactive player in that space. There's a lot of good reason for them to push for, ethical uses of technology, to push for privacy. And it's important that they, have a platform for do so. And, their capacity and technical knowledge and skill set is leveraged alongside government to achieve some of these aims. I suppose I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for once again highlighting the very important aspect of the role of local businesses that we often forget. And I think it's wonderful to hear the work that CIPE is actually doing, obviously, in various regions of the world. I find it quite interesting what you mentioned about this. This good example of government and businesses coming together in Indonesia, looking at this co-regulation and digital transformation. I mean, that's a very good example of some things that can be done in other places. You once again highlighted something that our previous speaker also highlighted, which was inclusiveness and not leaving really, again, no one behind. When we speak about the access to technology, we need to speak about inclusiveness. I know that Paulina highlighted the role and the importance of women, but you mentioned obviously other groups and other minorities, and so it's very important to look at this in a holistic way and make sure that we're talking about ways to move forward in an inclusive manner that really actually doesn't leave anyone behind. Thank you so much, Lisa. Let me move to our final speaker today, Luis Fernando. Hello. Luis Fernando, technology and innovation, while having a positive impact in improving democratic governance and transparency and government accountability, can also have, again, this negative impact in the way that is being used on democracy. We understand that as the executive director of the Red en Defensa de los Derechos Digitales in Mexico, you're engaged in the co-creation and implementation of Mexico's OGP commitment related to greater oversight of digital surveillance tools by the government and preventing the interception of private communication. This is actually quite interesting and goes right to the middle of what we're talking about today. What has been your experience regarding the implementation of this OGP commitment? And maybe if you can tell us what are some of the ways that you see that the National Action Plan in Mexico is promoting the use of digital technology to bolster democratic governance.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation first, and thank you for your question. Let me give you a little bit of background, and not background noise. I have a lot of background noise. I hope you are not listening to it, and if you are, I'm sorry. But they decided to make construction right when I was about to speak. But beyond that background noise, I want to give you a little bit of background of how this commitment from the Mexican government came out. And it's something unfortunate and painful to recognize, because I wish this wasn't the case. But unfortunately, in Mexico, in a few years back, we were able to document together with other civil society organizations that the Mexican government was using very powerful surveillance tools, particular one very famous now, Pegasus, a surveillance tool developed by an Israeli company, NSO group. And we discovered that it was used against journalists that were uncovering corruption in the government, human rights defenders, victims of forced disappearances, activists, opposition leaders who now are the government, for example. And definitely this became a big scandal. During the remainder of that government, there was really not any proper investigation or any way in which the government wanted to address the problems that arise from these findings. A new government came, a government that was in the opposition and that was surveilled with this type of tools. And they made a series of commitments that included not only stopping spying on people, but as part of the Open Government Partnership Action Plan, they made a commitment to create a group, a multi-stakeholder group, in which there was civil society and government, to come up with ways and safeguards regarding the acquisition, the use, and the accountability of surveillance tools in Mexico. And just, I forgot a little bit to mention something about the background as well. It was not only the surveillance, it was also that the acquisition of these tools is often non-transparent, with corruption behind it. In the aftermath of the revelations, we were able to discover that there was obviously no transparency, no oversight over the use of these tools. When the scandal came about, the company that provided this tool has, to this day, has not cooperated at all with the investigation, for example. So there's a general climate of impunity, of lack of regulation, of lack of transparency, of oversight, etc. And we welcome the commitments made by the current government, in particularly the one made under the umbrella of the OGP action plan. And we emphasize that trust can't be built without ways to verify that those commitments are being respected. As a very now famous phrase is, trust is very important, but trust but verify. We need to be able to verify that that trust is being upheld. And certainly certain areas of government, particularly in national security, they are not used to allow transparency, oversight, multi-stakeholder participation. So it definitely has been a really big challenge. However, we stress that the power that these tools possess, the demand that we transform the ways that accountability on this space has been understood in the past. We believe that even democracy itself is at stake. For example, to this day, we still don't know who was behind the attacks, other than who with names and surnames were behind the attacks. And the democratic institutions of Mexico are being, in a way, are still threatened by the extortion or attacks that can happen by those that have the intelligence gathered by these tools. So as soon as we don't have, as long as we don't have truth and justice on this case, well, those institutions remain vulnerable to attacks from those that perform surveillance on them in the past. So we have stressed in this process, in this working group in which we are part of with the government, the need to end impunity, for truth, for justice, for building a collective memory of what happened, so society can internalize that and can prevent that from happening in the future, but also regulation and safeguards that we need on the acquisition, accountability of these tools. As I mentioned, these tools are very powerful, are often used in secret, there are no safeguards, and that's a recipe for abuse. It's almost guaranteed that tools that powerful, allowed to be used with that lack of transparency, are going to be abused. So we have stressed the need to create regulation that about the acquisition, the use, and the accountability of these tools that, first of all, allows society to detect when these tools are being abused. We were lucky in knowing that these tools were abused. Probably 90% of the abuse of surveillance tools around the world is not even detected because these tools are becoming more powerful and more difficult to detect. That's why we stress that this is really important, that we develop strong institutions that can be up to the challenge of restricting and regulating and controlling these tools that can threaten democracy itself. Unfortunately, I have to admit that the working group process has not, to this day, give the results that we would like to see. We haven't given up on the process yet. We encourage the Mexican government to be more proactive. Definitely, there's a lot of resistance from people who were part of the previous governments and are still in the same government. What some people call the deep state in some places. It's a reality in many democracies. It's normal to some point that institutions of security, there's less change in the people that are there. So we need to continue to stress international and national pressure on governments to allow a different way to address this complicated problem. And I think to make echo of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations, we need to get this right and we need to be cautious. And that's why the UN has stressed the need for a moratorium on the acquisition of these types of tools. Also, for example, on the applications of artificial intelligence on society until we have safeguards that allow us to make sure that we can ensure that human rights can survive and that democracy itself can survive. I think those are the stakes. Finally, I would just end with, I think for decades, many people have thought that democracy is a trajectory that it's, the trajectory of the world is that everyone is going to be democratic. Unfortunately, I think with the power of surveillance tools, there is a real risk that democracies start to become more authoritarian if we don't get this right. So definitely welcome this discussion, and we hope that this encourages others to get involved in making sure that technology serves human rights and democracy and do not serve in the infringement of human rights and the rise of authoritarianism.
Thank you, Luis Fernando. I think it's fitting that we end with this very good example of one of the biggest threats, perhaps, that we're talking about today, and it's this the threat of surveillance tools that you mentioned, and the demand and the need that we have to transform the way that accountability is stressed in this regard. You talked about the importance of trust, obviously, and that really goes hand in hand with the need of oversight. So I think certainly the work of this particular OGP commitments, it's actually very, very important. It goes directly into countering and addressing this particular threat. Looking at the creation of regulations you mentioned or safeguards to ensure really that we're looking at the continuation of democracy and human rights, and the highlight of making sure that that these tools, that these regulations are actually ensuring transparency, in any case, in the acquisition of these tools. I think all very important things that you mentioned, and we hope to have an opportunity to continue to speak to you and follow the work of this OGP commitment in Mexico. That's quite important. Thank you so much, Luis Fernando. And thank you to all our speakers today. Before we close the panel, I just wanted to ask all of you, actually, and also invite our keynote speaker. Just wanted to ask just one final question. how can the different sectors, government, civil society, private sector, work together to address at the end these threats that technology can pose to democracy? Can any of you give any examples of, again, I think we heard right now from Luis Fernando, these examples of safeguards, tools and or models to prevent the abuse of new technologies, or any initiatives to address the growing influence, really, of digital authoritarianism at this time? I just open the floor now for any of our panelists.
I'm happy to jump in on this one. So I did mention the concept of co-regulation that we're seeing being discussed in Indonesia. I think also, you know, as a community of democracies, we have to remember that there can be, you know, sort of elements of, you know, we understand like this true cost of tech. So what are the most affordable devices and tools for governments and for businesses and even citizens often come with huge privacy risks or surveillance built in, or is simply sort of an extractive form of ICT. And we need viable and affordable alternatives. I think it's very challenging to suggest, you know, this is dangerous or this tool is anti-democratic without having an alternative that is, you know, more or less, you know, a similar cost to others. So I think there is importance in, if we're countering sort of like digital Silk Road infrastructure projects or cheap devices, because they're incredibly extractive, there needs to be clear alternatives. And then obviously there's a huge opportunity for greater public-private dialogue. I think that we need to see greater transatlantic consensus on digital regulations, norms, and standards. I think there's more that sort of the multilateral community can play in helping, you know, clarify some of those digital norms and standards, and then ensure that companies and governments within this community of democracy upholds them. You know, Luis touched on digital surveillance tools that are coming out of democracy, whether it be Israel, Sweden, the US, and elsewhere. And it's very challenging to make an argument against digital authoritarianism if we're seeing similar types of technologies coming out of democracies. And again, that gets into this enormous trust deficit that you know, both the private sector and government needs to be cognizant of, and the value of having civil society engaged in the dialogue process, in the policymaking process, and making sure that, you know, the decisions that are coming either at the national or international level protect human rights and, you know, support democratic institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa. Any of our other speakers would like to comment?
Yes.
Patricia,
sorry.
go ahead.
Go ahead. Please, go ahead.
Yes, regarding how to be able to get all the stakeholders in one place that actually can be all agree in one solution. For my experience, it was really hard for us to get them all in one place. So we had to work separately with each one of the stakeholders. So at the beginning, it was really hard to get the approval from the government itself and making such platforms that actually can be accessible by the public. And we have all the informations, the public information regarding what kind of laws that be actually been legislated and make it accessible for everyone. So my solution, I think it will be providing a solution that can actually helpful and useful by all. And you need to make sure that you can gain the trust from all parties that actually going to be part if your kind of proposals, if you can try and propose such new technologies, which will really, at the beginning, you will be facing the resistance because it's something and no one actually had been used before. So you need to make sure that you're actually getting all the feedback from all stakeholders to make sure that you actually, at first, you're protecting the human rights, the rights of participation, the freedom. At the same time, you're giving them the promise that you actually can secure some participation at the same time. So it is a kind of collaborative kind of access. But for us, or for me, as an opinion, it should be starting from the civil society to do the initiation of such kind of cooperation and make sure they can prevent and they can produce a solution that accessible for all and can be within the law and everything actually accessible and at the same time approved by all stakeholders.
Thank you, Egan. Paulina, I believe you wanted to say something?
Yes, just very briefly, I think that before we get into the specifics of what can be done to specifically tackle all of these threats, we first need to acknowledge what are the threats. First, that the threats exist and that what are the threats, and place the responsibility in the right stakeholders and players. So for example, we've discussed here the inclusion of minorities, but we've also discussed here that technology is a double-edged sword. And this is not something that each sector individually can tackle. This is a collective work between government, civil society, all citizens, and the private sector. So when we look at some of the threats, we can also see that this type of situations, for example, nowadays, how we're seeing in some countries, jail time for people in media that actually disseminate disinformation campaigns, because it's not the right approach. Instead, we really need to look into, for example, who are the responsibles? In many countries, for example, Latin America and in other countries in the world, social media platforms don't have a big responsibility. Governments are not making them responsible. They're actually being reactive more than proactive to solve the issue, in this particular case of disinformation as a main threat to democracy. So we really need to look into bringing this to the public global agenda and really attack it from where it is, which is assuming different responsibilities of all the stakeholders that are participating of this particular issue.
Thank you, Paulina.
If I could comment very briefly
Sure.
on that, I think something that is important to acknowledge is that many of the harms of digital technologies are not evident by the victims of those technologies. You don't know if you're being surveilled. You don't know how an algorithm is using which data from you to make automated decisions that impact you. And that's a really big challenge to address a problem if you don't really exactly know what that problem is and how that problem comes to be. So I think the first challenge that any regulation effort or any effort to address this should tackle is ensuring that the deployment and the deployment of these systems allows society and decision makers, particularly, to detect and to address these harms. It's very difficult, even from the civil society position, to really convince people that they should care about these issues sometimes, because it's not very evident. It's not as evident as other human rights challenges. If you're being detained or tortured, or you know you're being detained, you know the police came into your house. When you're being surveilled, when all these systems are making decisions that impact your life, that you don't know how, you don't even know that there's, for example, an algorithm in the middle of that decision. That's a really big challenge. So I echo some things that my colleagues have said and reiterate the call for a moratorium on deployment of certain systems until we come up with the safeguards needed, and the safeguards need to address this, to make the harms evident, because they are right now not evident, and that prevents us from addressing them. It's a little bit kind of like in the environment field, the precautionary principle. We need to be more cautious on the deployment of technologies, that then it's going to be very difficult to scale back, to make them not produce these bad effects for democracy and for human rights.
Thank you, Luis, Fernando, and to all our panelists. Actually, we have time for, I think, maybe one question. We have a question here in the chat box. It's actually directed to Ms. Paulina Ibarra and also to our keynote speaker, Dr. Tilleman. And that is, as panelists spoke extensively about the importance of access to technology, how can we bridge the gender gap, in your opinion? Paulina, would you like to?
Yes, sure. And this is a very interesting question because it really goes to the heart of what we've been doing in terms of research. The main issue for gender gap, particularly participation of women in democratic processes, is basically developing safeguards to make sure that women are actively participating at all levels, and looking at this from an intersectional point of view. We can just look at, for example, developing safeguards for women to be elected to Congress in an equal way as men. We also need to look at women and what's happening behind that in the personal aspect. So, for example, when we look at the issue of disinformation and fake news, we know that the way women are affected, women participating in democratic processes and public lives, is in a personal level. So we also need to look at the issues affecting them to make sure that gap is reduced. A few weeks ago, I was part of a seminar, participated of a seminar with the first prime president of Zimbabwe. And she was basically talking about the importance of bringing women to the political sphere, to the political area, participate in electoral processes, participate in public life. And she was saying that the only way, in many cases, unfortunately, to work on public policy that is equal and that is of benefit for women and men is actually making sure that those women get to Congress. And that is one of the most important aspects that I see in terms of the democracy and technology, how we can bring women to be participating in an equal way in Congress to make policy sound and equal. So, and when we look at how also we see the digital divide and how, from one region to another, we see very different percentages in terms of access. When we look at women and access to digital world, we know that gap is even more deeper. So there are multiple aspects that we need to look when we look into what we can do to kind of reduce that gap. I think a good example, and I'm very proud to mention this, is what's happening today with the constitutional process in Chile, where for the first time in history, there is a parity system looking into developing a new constitution. And I think that that's a good step in terms of reducing the gap. I don't see that the gap will be closed anytime soon. But again, we really need to look at all different aspects of women's life in order to try to work towards reducing that gap. Thank you, Patricia.
And I'll just say briefly on this, Paulina is certainly the expert, but from my standpoint, there are a few things that we need to recognize. The first is that there are long timelines around the development of the expertise required to engage effectively on these issues. And so what that means is we need to focus very far upstream. My daughter spends a lot of time studying the role of technology because I want her to be able to engage effectively on these issues when the time comes. And we really need to begin early cultivating the expertise so that individuals from all backgrounds are ready to play an active role in these conversations when they come of age. The second thing I would suggest is we are not doing our jobs as those who are helping to shape policy if we are not creating a very substantial role for women in the formation of these policies. We will not have good outcomes. We will not be serving huge swaths of the population that need to utilize these tools if women don't have a big role in the way our processes are structured. And the final point, and this was alluded to earlier by a number of the panelists, is that multi-stakeholder governance and co-regulation efforts along the line of what was mentioned in Indonesia can play a very useful role in diversifying the array of actors that have a voice in shaping policy on these issues. So again, start early, recognize that there is an imperative for a variety of reasons to have women represented in these processes, and then design multi-stakeholder efforts that can be diversified with a wide array of views in order to generate good outcomes.
Thank you, Tamika. I have one more question. I think we have time still. How can democracies defend themselves and their populations against mal and disinformation, specifically spread to undermine vaccination efforts? So a question here from the audience regarding COVID-19 and misinformation. Would anyone like to answer that?
I mean, I would love to, but it's someone else, because I think I've spoken a lot in this panel, so.
Yeah, I guess the question from the audience is, it's really specifically against what can we do to defend ourselves against misinformation, disinformation, misinformation regarding, the undermine of vaccination efforts, something that's we have seen.
Yes. If I may, yes. I think if we talk about democracies, they can actually develop policies that actually can protect their human rights and make sure that actually the laws actually going to be able to make sure that all the laws will be in the benefits of the people to speak, to be able to contribute to any kind of decision-making processes, or be able to be a part of that kind of making. If we talk about the misinformation, we're not going to make this kind of answer just for the COVID vaccinations. Any kind of misinformation is going to should be treated in the same way, by raising the awareness, make sure that we actually educate the people how to look for resources. If we just reading any news or any kind of articles should not be taken for granted. You need to make sure that you actually understanding what's more than one resources. Unfortunately, if we're talking an example of my communities, the majority of the news coming from WhatsApp groups, which is not related to any kind of news kind of broadcasts. So make sure that we raise the awareness, we let the people to understand how to use these technologies. We have seen that we're having with Facebook, and Twitter, they have actually added a section kind of to make sure that the information spread, if anything related to COVID, it is actually have been checked more than once by their team. So that's actually in a way how the technology itself can actually make it easier to, in a way that we actually can make sure that we lower the level of wrong information to be spread among the citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Ihad. I think we are reaching our time limit at this moment. So let me once again just thank our keynote speaker and all the panelists this afternoon for the very important insights that you shared with us today, both on the positive side and of course the negative side, or the threats that the technology can bring, and some solutions that actually were presented at the same time. All of you mentioned very important aspects of the need of inclusivity, of course, of affordable tools. I think that's something that we, as a matter of fact, in the working group on democracy and technology are actually looking at, and it's that idea of looking at open source tools. for democracy. The need to bridge the gap, of course, the important aspect of gender equality, and the need to begin to cultivate early that issue of expertise and to create that substantial role for women in the formation of policies. Really, in every single part of this process, women need to have a very big role. I think that has been highlighted enough today. But I will leave it here, and I will once again thank all our panelists. And before ending this, I'd like to give the floor to the Secretary General of the Community of Democracies for some closing remarks. Secretary General.
Thank you, Patricia. And thank you to our panelists and to all of our participants. This event was on preventing the abuse of new technologies and the growing influence of digital authoritarianism, was conducted on the margins of the Community of Democracies 10th Ministerial Conference. And so I want to thank the Working Group on Democracy and Technology and thank its chair, Georgia, for organizing this meeting with the Secretariat of the Community of Democracies. In our meeting today, we discussed topics of incredible importance. Technology and its innovations can undoubtedly have positive effects on strengthening democracy and improving the effectiveness of democratic institutions. We know that it can also empower citizens to amplify their voices and open new opportunities to exercise the rights of freedom of expression and of association. At the same time, as noted by our panelists, we've seen the use of technology can have a negative effect on democracy. Digital technology poses a risk to human rights in particular, with regard to privacy, data protection, misinformation, especially surveillance. The significant human rights and democracy of digital knowledge is our 28 member state, the Governing Council, addressed it in a joint declaration this week in our ministerial in New York. I encourage you to look at the declaration on our Community of Democracy's website. So today we're trying to address both aspects in which technology supports democracy.
Secretary
Also,
General, I believe we're losing you. I think there's a bad connection.
Yes, I think speaking of the internet, I think our connection is unstable. So let me just, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, so let me just conclude because I do have an unstable connection at the moment. Just by saying again, thank you to Dr. Tamika Tilleman. I think his ideas of how to take this third generation of internet is something that the Community of Democracy strongly agrees is a long and complex goal, but it's a goal worth having for democracy. Again, thank you to all of our panelists, and I wish you well and look forward to working with you again. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.